lot at you. Whole lot. In the introduction, like that title, Regenerative Placemaking, a Solutionary's Guide, to an Ecological City. So we hear a lot about green, sustainability. We hear, quite frankly, a lot of rhetoric. And the rhetoric is good for sparking a conversation, but it's like, what do we do with that conversation in action? So practice-oriented research is where I'm in, and that's the titles I fall under, I guess. Architect, artist, urban designer, one of the creatives, the wayward academicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, that's my focus. A concerned global citizen. So a husband, a father, an educator, a mentor, a lifelong learner. My name is Emmanuel Pratt. Sorry with that. I am the co-founder and executive director of a group called Sweetwater Foundation. And I am also a member of a for-profit L3C entity called Axel L3C. So we'll talk about that after. So from the creative side of looking at that and dealing with the realities of the cities, I live in the south side of Chicago. I work in the south side of Chicago. I also work around the city in places like Detroit. We have the city as an ever-evolving canvas. So for instance, population growth, we've all talked about this extensively. We have more and more people that are moving to the city globally. Chicago is a global city. It's indicative of what's happening. And this is from the Go to 2040 plan, looking at the population increase over the next, well, they wanted a trajectory towards 2050, but they landed at 2040 because there's a major impact that's happening on water, transportation, waste streams, where do people live, and what are the emerging industries that are coming as a result. If you have a lot of places that are empty and decaying, or if you have a lot of shifts of population to live in other areas, you have clusters of new forms of cities. So when you have a traditional form of a city, but then in the same city, you have its bipolar opposite. We have a lot of decay, a lot of frozen spaces that are sitting idle, particularly when we have waves of foreclosure that are impacting thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals. And what do we do with these spaces, right? If we don't do anything for a while, you notice the burn marks on that space, they become a problem space, right? A space of decay, death, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And would you buy your food there? I wouldn't buy any beauty supplies or food from there. So if you neglect it for too long, we know the formula. It becomes an erased entity. And I am not an economist, but I can go into the Keynesian approach towards like creative capital and destruction, et cetera, et cetera. And when you choose to erase something, and then how do you wipe the slate clean, and the forms of blight in order to reiterate that rhetoric. Public housing. We also know what happened in Chicago with public housing. We also know what happened with public housing around the country. This is in New Orleans, was a forced eviction process after Katrina. The building was actually fine. It was just already slated for another form of development. So that was what left over. When people wanted to come back and get their stuff, it was gone, and then we had this shell that was sitting waiting for new forms of development that never happened because we hit the collapse. So you have this aesthetic of an erosion, of decay. Around the notion of blight, do people know what the term blight means? I'm assuming. Oh, okay. So, blight, blight from its origin is actually from paleontology and the study of plants. It's the death and decay of a plant and cancer of a plant so they can no longer sustain life. In the 30s, it became applied as an economic evaluation tool for certain neighborhoods or communities, whether or not you would want to invest in them or not. Then in the 30s and the 40s, particularly in America, you had the FHA, the underwriting manual that then said, these are the choice areas to invest in, these are not the choice areas. And then that led to redlining. And then we fast forward to places like Chicago in 2014, and we're somehow confused that there's a major disinvestment in certain areas and not in others. So it has become a prescriptive pathology for disinvestment and investment opportunities. But it has also reiterated these chronic urban problems that are all interlinked. We've said it numerous times, like health, environment, education, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody can ever put a price tag on it. Nobody can put the numbers and the metrics on it. But people live there, right? So my photography and all the art stuff has been focused on who lives there and how do we respond in these spaces despite the neglect, despite the decay. And we do have to focus on the future, right? I don't know how to put a price tag on them. I wouldn't. I don't. So that's awesome. When we struggle with this notion of how do we reinvent ourselves and how do we figure out what our cultural identity is, especially when you're trying to figure out, do I escape this area? Do I live over here? What's the new? Do I work with Facebook? Do I work with this? Where do I work in this 21st century? So culture, most people think of like art and play, but it's actually the cultivation of thought passed on from one generation to another in the celebration of that culture. We have been creating this disruption of our culture, disruption of ourselves, finding each other, moving away from nature. And we do have an opportunity with gentrification. The traditional approaches toward gentrification are juxtaposing urban growth versus urban decline. So I'm going to speed through some of this. We are shifting into a new way of being, moving from one paradigm into another. And I'm proposing that we should be focusing on the notion of ecology that integrates social capital, human capital, natural capital through something like this, right? Urban agriculture, localized food production, linked to education, linked to these new innovative industries that are starting to pop up, like aquaponics, offer a formula for regenerative placemaking. So something as simple as seed, soil, water, and light actually is quite complex. If you really appreciate the biology between the processes. Aquaponics is cool. It's an ancient technique, but in an urban setting, more and more people are really appreciating the preservation of water and the fact that the waste streams of your fish is actually a fertilizer for your plants. And if you appreciate the biology of the system and you appreciate how to teach the education of chemistry, then you can have fresh basil, lettuce, arugula, chard, etc. in a system. So out of the abstract realm, you're starting to test your rigor and imagination through science. So, case examples. Now, I said I have a lot of images. This is very intentional. I want to show you. Focuses on solutions. Focuses on solutions. What is that? Empty warehouse. That used to be that. Not that long ago. That then quickly became that. Because, the industrialization process, jobs go overseas, what have you. But when you trigger the imagination, you have a conversation between humans and individuals as we interact, like we said earlier. You find people who have skills that are unemployed or underemployed. And then all of a sudden the roofers and the carpenters and people like me and some other folks and friends find a way into doing something, partnering with veterans and producing food, right, in an unused space. Lots of it. Up to a point you can get to 200 pounds of greens a week, 20,000 fish in the space. But again, more important is what do we do with the future? So once they understand and see that that's possible in that neighborhood where nothing was possible or very little was possible or other alternatives were, and then having a very interesting dynamic of connections that would not have been happening otherwise. Putting a tool in the hand, making math make sense, science makes sense, care, and creating a culture of care that does have numbers associated with it, qualitative and quantitative metrics. And then you have to, do the art. That's one case example. Where the kids get mentored by the adults who then get inspired to do their thing. And then they say, wait a second, I'm a cook, I'm a chef, I'm a this, I'm a that. Then they find themselves in the projects. It has commercial applications. Because we do live in cities, there are lots of vacant lots, lots of vacant buildings. Now we're starting to figure out, if you put all of your energy focusing on the fish, and you can figure out what are your electrical needs, what are your temperature needs, et cetera, et cetera. If you're doing an indoor setting, what type of fish, yellow perch, tilapia, catfish, et cetera. And if that is what your product is in the middle of February in Chicago or Milwaukee with no lights, then it's very possible. So if you go to the south side of Chicago, an old shoe warehouse, where I teach at Chicago State University, we have an old shoe warehouse, same formula, abandoned, a zombie property, if you will. utilizing the stuff that was inside of the space, the metal racking system. How many warehouses have metal racking systems? The display cases for the shoes become the grow beds. Bam. And in about, 2-3 months, you're producing indoors, year-round. Changes the game. Lots of fish. But then the vacant lot becomes in question. The vacant lot outside that was a brownfield site that would then do raised beds and do something really, really simple, greenhouse, raised beds, maximizing natural light, go shopping outside, becomes the indoor and outdoor classroom for the kids. That then find mentors, right? So that's what we try, and then it becomes a science project for the classroom. So I did this as a mycelia project as a art project, an art installation project to jumpstart some of these spaces, but bring in all of these folks from all these different professions and et cetera, communities to find each other. So we take places like that are unused, throw some thoughts on the walls, chalkboard paint, whiteboard paint, doesn't cost much at all. Have people join in through the art, find each other through conversation and expression. And food. So we got to a point where we did these reiterative small experiments, fractals. And 5-gallon, 10-gallon, 20-gallon, 30-gallon, 50-gallon, 250, 100,000, whatever, et cetera. And we put it in the school settings. And actually we have there's 5 official labs within Chicago Public Schools now, and it's the first ever, I think, aquaponic policy for CPS that we're talking to other cities right now. We have no idea how to do the metrics on this process either. So you have new forms that are starting to physically pop up in the city because we have this new type of, thought forms, tuples. And it's amazing to watch that become a living learning laboratory, a living classroom. Oops. That they create. That is a project in a school in an unused sunroom space, that the kids, we work with them directly. They learn how to build it, maintain it, sustain it. They've never grown chard, they've never grown basil, they don't know it. But yet now they know the value of it. They know what it is, how to grow it, how to maintain it, how to sell it, how to package it, how to eat it. Bam. Because we gamed the class. It was a part of their extensions of one of their classes. So now they really appreciate that regenerative principle of that food. And they understand the value of that food because they connected with so many different people along the way of that journey. Next step is we're trying to close the gap on how to cook it. When you marry this to the digital technology and where we're going with all types of emerging tech startups that are looking at how to capitalize on green markets, green jobs, what have you. We're teaching these kids, same kids, Google SketchUp. How do you model what you just had an idea for? How do you pitch it to somebody so that you can get the products and the materials in order to build it? How do you visualize it so that you can make it sexy? You really got to make it appeal to the senses so that you can look at the future of the kitchen. So you're growing your own herbs and basil. The tilapia on the wall. It's crazy. So we started the process of really packaging this and looking at marrying it with MacArthur Foundation, Mozilla Foundation, and the Digital Media Learning Challenges of aquaponds, an interdisciplinary tool through education through aquaponics. So we're gaming it. If you do well, like the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, if you do well, you show it, you demonstrate it, you prove it, you have a portfolio, then we badge you. On your phone, on your laptop, you create a portfolio. You can then, we vouch for you. And then our chef vouches for you. And then the architects vouch for you. So you have this really windy career pathway that says you don't have to worry about what you want to be right now, but you have to understand the value base and then just explore. So when you do experiments with water, you're actually learning water chemistry and hydrology and what have you, right? The gateway. So that's what we are creating this pathway. So it does have social impact, economic impact, environmental impact, and then the human factor. The whole ecosystem. If you want to learn more about this, you definitely should check out Reconnect Learning. the initiative that MacArthur and Mozilla and a whole host of people are looking at of this open badging ecosystem that the Clinton Global Initiative and others said is the future of the economy. And people were like, what are you talking about? But now people are starting to understand. So there is this 2 million, I think it jumped to 10 million Better Futures initiative. And there's a whole host of different entities that are looking to explore this stuff. So now, this is where we take the theory. We've actually been doing practices, but you take this theory and you put it into these realms. People say, how is it sustainable? Yeah, it takes too much heavy lifting, et cetera, et cetera. But if you can revitalize the house and you can figure out how to do education and you can figure out how to do the human infrastructure to get to a point of producing something to create an actual source of revenue generation that feeds back into the system that everybody buys in, then you have a sustainable project that you can put into a local economy. So our latest experiment is in Inglewood at the intersection of Woodlawn, Inglewood, and Washington Park. There's a 2-acre empty block that's been transformed into a farm in a residential neighborhood. It's zoned as a farm in a residential neighborhood. That's the site 3 years ago, and that's the site now. We've grown watermelon, corn, chard, arugula, kale, multiple types of stuff. And we are employing people from the neighborhood. We are feeding hundreds of people weekly from the neighborhood. And then we got the house across the street. The house was a 3-bedroom house. It's been vacant for 8 years. It was stripped twice. The market fluctuation was amazing. It went from like 100,000 to 300,000, back down to this, back up. It didn't make any sense. It made no logical sense whatsoever. You see all that empty land? Well, we turned it into a canvas. So that's spray paint. And that's the finished mural for the Think, Do laboratory. If you think it, do it, try it, remix it, open source it, try and figure it out, which career you want to go. And so I'll just go here. We have cooking classes inside. Everything is chalkboard and whiteboard paint. We put all the thoughts up on the walls. We're featuring Chicago Ideas Week, Chicago Art Month. We'll do this. So the next step is, what are we doing? We are targeting other places like firehouses that used to be have a civic role and responsibility, but they don't have an economic valuation. I literally ask people, what is valued at? They're like, there's no value. There's no market value. That's crazy. But there's a handful of these that are historic landmarks. And we say, yeah, let's toy with it. Let's look at what it could be for some form of regenerative principle that could become a tourist spot, a food production spot. Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm going to go back. This area here, Whole Foods is 3 minutes away. They're going to be coming. So they've been to the site, and they're watching, and we're having conversations. And I'm going to have a conversation with you about that. But if we start really, really interrogating what it could be, there's lots of possibilities for ecological cities. And there grows a neighborhood. That's it.
Questions?
Sure. I came to it because I've grown up and lived in communities that have been suffering from this. I was told, being an artist and what have you, to go into something that will actually pay you. So I decided to try and go into architecture. Then I got really, really frustrated with architecture because I loved the design, I loved all that stuff, went to Cornell for architecture. But in order to have a solid paying job and luxuries, et cetera, you had to work for certain types of firms who only worked with certain types of clients and not the, it's kind of weird working on some top, high-end design and then going home and having to shop. Weird. So I moved away from that, went into graphic design, photography, documentary, et cetera, traveled, and kept coming back to this issue of this chronic urban problems, like the food, this, that, and the other. So really, really depressing looking at housing policy when I went to grad school for urban design and PhD in planning. Super depressing looking at all the problems, and that's why we really want to focus on this whole solutions and solutionary aspect. So what do? You find places that are quote unquote blighted that are labeled as having no value or limited value. So the current example, the aquaponics thing is a partnership with the university who basically wants the programming to attract other folks, reach out to the community. So it's a hybrid partnership. So that takes care of a lot. And we, as long as we expose, outreach, do workshops, we increase our enrollment, et cetera, it's a great win-win combination partnership. It's in the College of Arts and Sciences. Now, the farm site, $1 a year lease, partnership with the city for the two sites. Because they've been, if you look at the contrapositive analysis, if-then scenarios, if the city has to pay $4,000 to $10,000 a year in order to maintain these empty parcels, and you have 20 parcels contiguous, how much money is that? So now, for the sake of just saying, oh, we have a partnership with a responsible partner and a network of partners that want to claim and live there and work there and do all that stuff, then go for it. 5-year lease, show and prove it, do the heavy lifting. They get credit for the results. Right? So in the process, on our board, we have people from IBM, we have restaurant owners, we have all these other folks in the education realm. So we, very mixed conversation from multiple professions, architects, that say they want to look at the future forms of the city and all different facets. So we have to find those spaces. Now, the next step is, in that site, we have almost 3 acres, and we're about to get another 2 to do an orchard in the same strip. So soon enough, that's going to become an urban agricultural district. It becomes a tourist attraction. It becomes this. It's right off the metro train. And it's, there's a regenerative process. They're trying to figure out how to bring capital into places like Inglewood, et cetera. So we want to do it in a responsible way. We don't want to wipe people out. We actually have a relationship with our neighbors. So that was a long answer. Apologize. So I'm a guinea pig. I'm part of a network of guinea pigs that are out there just showing that it's even possible. So if we try to play the numbers game, you try and go, what is the yield of 2 acres versus traditional approaches of yields of industrial agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. You're never going to win because there's a subsidized process, there's this, there's that, there's machinery and all that stuff, right? So I can say definitively we have X amount of rows producing X amount of yield with X amount of product, reaching X amount of people, all that kind of stuff. So we're out there testing it, trying it. For instance, that is the first time there's ever been an urban farm in that neighborhood. So how do you zone it? The city's been amazing in their support. We have to take that empty house and rezone that area into a commercial. Just on one area, one strip. Because it was crazy, because we all agreed, everybody around the table said that the zoning is from 1970 something. We're like, well, that doesn't apply. So the policies, the zoning, and then shifting the perception. That's the hardest thing. That's one of the reasons why we do this reiterative piece, having conversation after conversation after conversation, because we have to have people really appreciate the work. Most people do not honestly appreciate the work. They do not honestly appreciate what it takes, the heavy lifting, into reconnecting with people and shifting perceptions of like, there's no value here, what are you wasting your time for? One thing that's really helpful, having an entity like a Whole Foods or Mariano's or whatever into the equation that says, well, yeah, we value local. It doesn't have to be organic per se because you're a small farmer. We value local. So could you tell us what you could have on the shelf? And then we're like, cool. Could you tell us how many kids you could employ? Nice dynamic. Okay.
Like there's a lot of different sub-initiatives that you have. You have the education component, you have the hydroponics, you have livelihoods, you have art, you have a lot of different things. Yeah. And would you say that, I'm going to give you kind of 2 options, or maybe you can say it's sort of a hybrid. One could argue that by not focusing on one, that you might end up with some that struggle, or like it might be hard to have adequate resources to do all those things well? Or do you find that they actually complement each other and you're able to do each better because you have so many different activities?
I have a small organization. We just believe in embedding ourselves within networks of people who want to do that stuff. So we have this whole MO of like 3 to 300 in a conversation. What does that mean? You talk to several teachers that have a classroom of 25 to 30 students and no other X amount of teachers that want to do an after-school project, whatever. So we have a small-scale experiment, like those little aquaponic systems, that I can get it to a price point of $30, right? And then you have a strength in numbers. You put it out there as much as possible, and you have a trial and error factor, and you get around 33% or something that come back. But it's enough to be to the next step. You bring in the parents, you bring in so-and-so, you bring in the neighbor, you bring in the next teacher, and it's still going on its own. So what we've been doing is jump-starting programs and then just guiding them and then connecting them with other people. And you move on. That's what sustainability is supposed to be, right? When it comes to some of these other farming pieces, when you actually, it's really interesting economics. I haven't figured it out yet. But the more people you reach and the more they harvest, and you get a donation from them, they're actually working on your behalf because they're harvesting, and we don't possibly have enough labor in order to pay enough people to harvest 2 acres of a site, 20,000 plants. But the more you have that conversation and the people are spreading and they're finding food and then they're finding other people, so there's a formula to it. There's totally a formula to it. And I would challenge, how would you divorce the conversation of food, soil, water, and energy into silos? I think that's the problem. That's how we got here. I don't think you can. I don't think you can divorce and focus on just one little aspect on this realm. Maybe I'm wrong. I think we got to be messy right now, just to try and figure out where we're going to go. Not always. So we've had a situation where somebody was like, yeah, well, I have X amount of hundreds of $1,000s work with us. We're like, but you don't need it. But we have another group that really, really wants it, but has no money to do it. So is there a compromise where we can take both of these in the same conversation or a similar conversation and figure out how to balance that out? Like, we have that all the time. We have that conversation all the time. It's difficult. We haven't figured out exactly how to choose one over the other, but by widening the circles of conversation is usually how we figure out the next steps. Yeah, I mean, we rely a lot on open data platforms. So for instance, if we go do a small scale intervention at a school, bam, that is very replicable and it's scalable within the school. And our program with the aquaponds is relying on each one of these students to reach other people and they get badges, et cetera, et cetera. Then we encourage them to go out and teach other people. At that point, they've proven they've done it, they've maintained it, they go out and show some other folks. I was out at Mozilla Festival, MozFest, on Friday in London, Friday to Monday, and then we did this kind of, session, and then all of a sudden these people said, yeah, we want that too. I was like, how are we going to do that? So there's a Google Doc form, there's basic instructions, there's a network and community of people that are figuring out how to cross time zones in order to have a conversation for experiments. So we do rely a lot on shared information to accelerate the process of, right? There was a guy that we met, just as a quick aside, that's 3D printed. We didn't even get to 3D printing and all that stuff, but he 3D printed a monitoring system, PhotoSync with a Q. He 3D printed this system that you can take any leaf and you put it into this thing, this gadget that's open source and printed, and it monitors the level at which of photosynthesis of that plant. That makes science really cool. And he is willing to partner with us from Michigan State University to figure out how do we marry that into emerging tech industries, but keep it like still hands-on. So we're, I don't know how to put that in.